We're here now once again with Autisticus Spasticus. We've had a couple of conversations, and the last one you read out a fascinating and brilliant essay, in my opinion. This is a further talk about God, really. And Neil Donald Walsh, who wrote a series of books called Conversation with God, which I really used to like, now I don't. But they are very, very interesting, and they were such a refreshing change to the way God was represented in the Bible, which I was brought up with. But anyway, he often said, like, it's not important whether you believe in God. What's important is what you believe about God. And that resonates with me. If a person never asked me, do I believe in God? It's just such a strange question, because number one, what does believe even mean? A, and B, God, as far as I can tell, is indefinable by definition. You can't define God. So what does that mean? Do I believe in? You could say any old word. Do I believe in anything, right? And how could I answer that question? But what's more interesting for me is, well, if you do believe in God, what is the nature of that God? Is that God benevolent? Is that God neutral? Is that God malevolent? And that's where I'm coming from, and I can't see any evidence of God's benevolence. I know that you've prepared a well thought through article. I know that you haven't necessarily finished it yet, but you've prepared something quite substantial, and I'd like to invite you to share it with us.
Well, this one I've called it The Untenable Status of a Benevolent Creator, Omnipotent Obligations, and the Impermissibility of Imperfection. I feel that a definitive conclusion as to the existence of God has already been provided on both an empirical and a philosophical front. On the empirical side, you need an anthropocentric universe in order to seriously entertain the notion of God and or an afterlife, and we don't live in one. A disclaimer here: anthropocentric universe simply means one in which man is the measure of all things and he is central to creation, which I think obviously a God would need to have a hand in. Dinosaurs and many other forms of prehistoric life were here much longer than we were. If the history of our planet were represented in the form of a 24-hour clock, the first signs of organic life would not have appeared until around 8:30 p.m. For perspective, humans have existed for the equivalent of a nanosecond. On the philosophical side of things, the problem of non-God objects is insurmountable. In its simplest form, this boils down to an obvious question: why would a perfect being create an imperfect world? The answer, of course, is equally obvious: they wouldn't. I find it astounding that so many people bought into the idea of a benevolent creator for so long, when everything around us indicates that he must be positively schizophrenic. And even if this was a perfect world, the question would still arise as to why they even created anything at all, although we, in our state of perpetual bliss, would be less inclined to ask such a question. God having a desire to create implies that he was lacking something. He was incomplete in some way, and something that is incomplete cannot meet the definition of perfection. Likewise, a perfect creation would have to be self-sustaining and impervious to harm. None of the atheists' observations ever really present a problem for the true believer, since
I'm sorry to interrupt. You cut out just when you said impervious. So could you just go back there, impervious, and read from there, and I'll edit it out afterwards.
Okay. Likewise, a perfect creation would have to be self-sustaining and impervious to harm. None of the atheists' observations ever really present a problem for the true believer, since the injustices of the world, a product either of God's irrationality, mediocrity, or malevolence, can be excused for them by the mere fact that he is God and therefore can do no wrong. Quote, "How dare you attempt to hold God accountable for all the gratuitous suffering and evil in the world?" End quote. That's the kind of indignation we would hear. Indignation is their gut reaction, and they will always make excuses for God regarding the existence of evil. For they would rather have a malevolent creator than no creator at all, such is the extent of their dependency. They will never condemn all suffering as gratuitous and unjustifiable, because to do so would be to condemn their God. The rule maker can do whatever he likes. He answers to nobody. And the insinuation that he be held accountable offends them. They argue from the perspective and the value system of one who already believes and has a vested interest in a particular outcome. They don't like their scripture to be criticized in a very blunt manner by outsiders, as this tends to highlight the absurdity and inconsistency of their beliefs. Very often, an appeal to nuance is made. Scripture is like an onion with many layers and many different and often conflicting interpretations of what is meant. I cannot fathom why any God would make a point to be so deliberately ambiguous. As such, the theist tries to solve the dilemmas we point out from within their theological framework. The problem of non-God objects, while certainly applicable to Jehovah, is not tailor-made for him. Adherents of the Abrahamic faiths are incapable of discussing the possible motivations of a deity rather than the deity they already happen to believe in. They would have to step outside their insular worldview in order to have that discussion, which would leave them vulnerable to external criticisms of the concept of deities in general, which they are not equipped to deal with. They can only ever respond to these questions from an internal perspective, which is constrained by all manner of esoteric values and nonsensical rules that are particular to the Abrahamic conception of God and do not apply to a more general conception. Perhaps this insularity is best illustrated by their cliched response to the problem of evil, namely that it originates from man's sin rather than God's malice. Ascribing the root of all evil to sin is a prime example of the inability of organized religions to grapple with problems externally, from beyond the internal framework that binds them. People who don't subscribe to the Abrahamic faiths are free to apply unrestrained scrutiny and see that the stories of the Bible, like the fall and the flood, are ridiculous, and that no supreme being would behave as illogically as Jehovah does. Some theists have said that God is not a servant here to dote on us, and have invoked the analogy of a parent and a demanding child. This analogy, as predictable as it is absurd, fails miserably. The child does not owe the parent anything, but the parent is morally obligated to care for the child, as the child did not ask to be created. They were created by the parent for gratuitous and ultimately self-serving reasons. And so the parent cannot claim the moral high ground, nor can they accuse the child of not fulfilling their expectations. The parent is to blame for the child's failings. the parent does not have carte blanche to emotionally or physically abuse the child in any way simply because they begat the child. The burden of responsibility always lies with the parent. These points apply to the relationship between the creator and the created, whether we be talking about parent and child or God and mankind. The theist is ultimately arguing that God has a divine right to be a sadist, much as the slave owner has the legal right to abuse and even kill his property. Theists also like to argue that logic and reason are forms of faith. This is a very desperate, I always struggle with the pronunciation of this French term, tu quoque or tu quoque. I haven't actually heard it pronounced aloud, but I know what it means. This is a very desperate tu quoque or quoque, to pull out of the hat. In French, that basically means you too, as in you're applying the criticism you've received to the person who has criticized you.
This is a sorry, just to pop in there. It's one of the well-known logical fallacies, isn't it?
Yeah. How do you pronounce it again? 'Cause I haven't.
I don't know, but can you just explain the actual fallacy, please, one more time?
Yeah, well, it would be like it's sort of a tit for tat kind of thing. You criticize someone over something, and then rather than respond directly to that criticism, you simply turn it around and throw it back at them.
Right.
And it may be the truth that there's a hypocrisy there, but that's unavoidable in being human. It all comes down to the how egregious the hypocrisy is, I think. Because obviously none of us are saints. We can't be consistent with absolutely everything. It's impossible in a universe full of paradoxes as this is, But yeah, so it's sort of a spiteful sort of "I am rubber, you are glue" brand of argumentation, which I find insufferable. So this is a very desperate French phrase I can't pronounce, to pull out of the hat, but it is to be expected. For those of us of sound mind, rational inference is our default faculty, and I always value and expect the very best in all things. It's probably why I'm so often disappointed. This world is decidedly not the best one conceivable, as it is only too easy to imagine a better world in innumerable ways and to innumerable degrees, although still bound within the nomological limitations of the mind. The theist highlights these limitations and argues that God and his motivations lie beyond them. To illustrate how absurd this is, we can consider Sheba's fridge analogy. If we go to the fridge and it is empty, and someone repeatedly tells us that we aren't looking hard enough, and we take the entire fridge apart down to the last screw, we still find no food, then we can safely conclude that there is no food to be found. But if that person still insists we are not looking hard enough, that we don't have the requisite senses or level of knowledge to find the food, then we have every right to call them a lunatic. This analogy is not alluding to the location of God, but to the exhaustion of all possible explanations as to why a supreme being would create a world that contained even a single minute imperfection, let alone the staggering degree of imperfection and injustice we perceive. It would not be tolerated in any other arena of debate to appeal to the unfalsifiable, beyond mortal comprehension excuse that the theist inevitably falls back on. The theist imagines that when I die and God's divine wisdom and purpose is revealed to me, it will be a stunning revelation, like seeing new color for the first time. But I would still indict him because he didn't do things my way. I don't care what unfathomable motives he might have. I would stand defiant before the tyrant. But unfortunately, I'm never going to be able to confirm how right I am, and the theist is never going to realize how wrong he is, because when we die, there is nothing, our consciousness is absorbed back into the eternal void of emptiness from whence it came. We can safely disregard whatever experiences the theist claims to have had, for the simple reason that the universe does not revolve around humanity, our needs, our desires, or our preferences. In a universe that is not anthropocentric, which means humanity being the center of all things, an afterlife solely for humans and no other organisms makes no sense. There are countless other beings that share our world with us, and what happens to them when they die shall surely befall us as well. The only way the believer can reconcile this with the notion of an afterlife is by granting that all other creatures have one too. Now, would we seriously entertain the notion that insects have an afterlife? How about dinosaurs or bacteria? I shall assume, hopefully, that the absurdity of such propositions are self-evident. The theist thinks we have no right to expect perfection from God, even though it is a reasonable expectation to have of a supreme being who is not constrained by any prior logistical or external factors. If you were God, would you create anything less than perfect? I know that I certainly would not. But for the theist, moonstruck at the supposed majesty of his infallible Lord's creation, the mere fact that we exist at all is proof of his existence, and that's more than enough to be singing his praises. I am not so easily impressed. I would expect a perfect being to be capable of delivering the perfect world I can imagine with ease. I won't be satisfied with the pathetic spectacle we see on display all around us, which oscillates between mediocrity at best and evil at worst. It really isn't asking much of an omnipotent being. If I can imagine better than what he has created, then he's out of a job. The theist objects that my idyllic world is incompatible with free will, but I disagree. We could simply posit that in the idyllic world, much like Tolkien's angelic elves, committing evil acts simply wouldn't be in man's nature, a nature which would ultimately be attributable to a benevolent creator's flawless design. In this sense, man's inability to do evil would be nomological in origin, rather than the result of any divine intrusion upon free will. While there would be no childbirth in the idyllic world, men and women would still exist, and the most intimate expression of love would still exist for the purpose of bonding. However, since our bodies in this idyllic world would not function as organic machines, instead of the crude act of penetration and the fleeting pleasure of orgasm, a much more intense and enduring experience of ecstasy would be felt by embracing, kissing, or merely looking at one's lover. The spectrum of possible scenarios we can imagine, while not infinite, is still vast and unexplored. Just because things are a certain way in our world, this isn't necessarily the way a creator would have had to make them, especially if it is within our humble ability to imagine preferable scenarios. The theist further objects that my idyllic world, being in many respects static, is incompatible with the law of cause and effect. But again, I disagree. If everything had been optimally designed in the first place, there would be no need for change. Any kind of incremental improvement wherein there are imperfect intermediary stages is inexcusable. A perfect world would, by definition, be flawless from its inception and require no maintenance, so God would not have to micromanage everything. It is ludicrous to think that such a world would be impossible for God to create. In saying that God is bound by certain rules, like the laws of mathematics and physics, the theist is admitting that there are forces at work that precede God, and to suggest that anything exists outside of God's jurisdiction would call his omnipotence into question. The old conundrum of whether God could create an object so heavy he couldn't lift it is a prime example of the bind that the theist finds himself in, since he is going to end up conceding God's limitations either way he answers. I shall describe 3 possible scenarios for existence. In scenario 1, the world exists in a state of continuous perfection. No component can be altered or degraded in any way, nor can it be improved, as all the attributes of this creation are intrinsically positive and are calibrated to their maximum degree. In scenario 2, the world is built on the opposing forces of negativity and positivity, which are locked in an eternal struggle. The balance of power is constantly in flux. Sometimes things may be very bad and then miraculously improve, while other times they may be very good but inevitably fall victim to entropy. This power struggle continues indefinitely. In scenario 3, existence begins at the worst possible level in every respect. Arbitrary suffering is the norm, but gradually, over an extended amount of time, the state of affairs becomes less bad until eventually the duality of scenario 2 is reached, progressing until eventually reaching a state wherein the positive outweighs the negative. Now, of these 3 scenarios, which would you say was the most desirable? Obviously, the first proposed scenario, in which there are no intermediary negative states, and which were never necessary in the first place. A problem solved is a problem caused, as solutions invariably create new dilemmas. What is better than a problem overcome? The problem having never existed in the first place, as I have said before. We can thus conclude that if a God were to create a world, he would be logically and ethically obliged to generate scenario number 1. I think it's perfectly apparent that the world in which we are currently living is a hybrid of scenarios 2 and 3. Ergo, God does not exist, and the world is both imperfect and incapable of being perfected. Some have claimed that even if it is nonsensical, one should believe in a religion because it is evolutionarily adaptive and encourages procreation. This is a particularly poor defense, as religiosity keeps the whole wretched cycle of existence going. People only believe in God because the alternative is terrifying, and only by deluding themselves and masking reality can they perpetuate our intergenerational participation in it. It seems implausible to them that such a universe, seemingly fine-tuned for life, could have originated from nothing. It seems improbable to me too, but a perfect being creating an imperfect world seems even more implausible. Evolution is an absolutely horrific system, and the notion that a benevolent creator will utilize a process as horrendously cruel and inefficient as evolution is absurd. If the universe is fine-tuned for life, then the quality of those life forms and the lives they lead allows us to gauge this experiment. I, for one, find it woefully devoid of merit, and for the work of an omnipotent being, it is absolutely abysmal. Unless God creates a world that is equal to himself in all its aspects, he is degrading the state of affairs, which in turn would imply that he is not a maximally great being. The theist says that we analyze, critique, and attempt to improve the world from a limited and fallible mortal perspective. But I imagine we could achieve flawless results, or at least much better than they are, if we had God's powers. And that is the position from which I am speaking. If any of us were in God's position at the beginning, when the slate was completely clean, what possible motivations could we have for creating the world as it currently exists rather than the idyllic world which I have partially described? This is the point where the theist once again invokes the limitations of mortal comprehension and appeals to epistemic humility, and I in turn direct them back to Sheba's fridge analogy. Because of the theist's obstinate refusal to concede defeat and part with his illusion, this circularity will continue indefinitely. It never ceases to amaze and disgust me how many people use the life is a test excuse, or life is a video game, as I refer to it somewhat flippantly. God is omniscient, so he doesn't need to test us. Why would he create souls that he knows will fail the test? If the afterlife is paradise, what good would the knowledge gained from suffering and torment do us there? What does a child dying of cancer learn that would be valuable in the afterlife? It's desperate, contrived nonsense, and it speaks volumes of the limited mortal mind that conceived it. What use does an immortal soul have for a mortal body in which it is susceptible to all manner of indignity and degradation? None at all. All imperfect intermediary states are gratuitous and cruel, and the suffering that living organisms endure on a scale that defies comprehension is not justifiable under any circumstances. God inflicting suffering would always be wanton and malicious, as it is not necessitated. There is no reason he had to create a world with suffering in it, since the slate was clean before creation. Nothing was at stake. God fails my test, the test of making any sense. In conclusion, everything that is wrong with the world can ultimately be blamed on God, because he has ontological primacy over all things. If intimidation and threats are the best tools he has for encouraging us to believe in him, that tells us a lot about his character. Quite frankly, an eternity of paradise would not atone for my mortal years of misery. A paradise awaiting us after we die would only prove that our mortal life had been utterly gratuitous. While I acknowledge the possibility that God exists, he would be a malevolent God and would therefore be no use to me. For all intents and purposes, a malevolent creator is interchangeable with a non-existent creator. What use is an evil God to us? About as much use as a fictional one. Neither are worthy of my attention. God may have my tortured soul, but he will never have my love, my respect, or my forgiveness. If he does exist, hasten the day I confront him on his own turf. What a fight it shall be on that long-awaited day when wills collide. Bring it on.
Beautiful. Should we leave it there, or do you want to?
I can talk a little more. I mean, there's a few other paragraphs I'll have a look at, which they're ones which I haven't quite yet integrated into the whole, and I don't know if I will.
Okay. Yeah, you can do that.
I'll just have a look at some of them and see if there's any that would be suitable. Oh yeah, well, there's one here that I have, which I was going to put in later, a small paragraph. I do indeed think, it sounds grotesquely egotistical, but I do indeed think I'm probably more intelligent than the theologians who split hairs over the small print in their book of fables. It doesn't matter how many sesquipedalian words they toss out. What they're ultimately doing is defending God's intricate and nuanced reasons for being a sadist, even though he doesn't have to be. So as you can see, this paragraph is sort of an extension of what I had written earlier. He could have created an absolutely perfect universe, but no, he has these unfathomably complex reasons for allowing chaos and suffering to reign supreme. Actually, it would make more sense for him to create nothing at all, since if he has a desire to create, as I said earlier, that suggests he's lacking something, and God is not supposed to lack or want for anything. So, no, to make out that God is ultimately constrained by and must remain consistent with the laws that he himself has authored is ridiculous. Continue looking. There's only 2 pages left. Yeah, there's some other more, I suppose, more low-level criticisms that I have, more flippant ones. This one here, again, this would be a criticism which is directed more at the Abrahamic conception of God. The theist must surely wonder why God gave the ability to regrow limbs to the gecko, gave naturally developed muscles to the gorilla, gave the ability to regrow teeth to the shark, and bestowed the best engineered eye upon the octopus. Aren't humans supposed to be the pinnacle of his creation? The fact that these other animals have advantages over us would seem to indicate otherwise. Fish have gills, so they don't have to worry about choking. Because obviously in humans, you can't breathe and eat at the same, the airway is the same. Whereas in fish, it's separate. And dolphins as well with their blowholes. Why couldn't we have separate passageways for eating and breathing? Why does God display favoritism towards the fish? Again, it is ludicrous. Let's see. There's another one here. It is sort of about God, but it overlaps with my criticism of postmodernism as well. I have noticed that believers often say you can't prove with 100% certainty that God doesn't exist, which is disingenuous of them. I don't require 100% proof for anything, because I doubt you can ever get 100% proof for anything. Postmodernists are always demanding completely unassailable proof, precisely because they know nobody can ever attain it. But we can attach a probability to things, and for God, I feel that the probability that he doesn't exist is in the 99th percentile, which is good enough for me. Another recurring theme I've noticed over the years is that they argue, again, this is why I haven't integrated these paragraphs yet, because some of them are very similar, noticed over the years is they argue as if God is restricted by the very laws he presumably creates. If he is not the originator of these laws, then that raises very serious questions indeed. I have asked them, does 1 1 + 1 = 2 because God says so, in that case it is an arbitration, a matter of divine will and not logical necessity. It would therefore be conceivable that God could have created an alternate universe where 1 + 1 = 3. However, if 1 + 1 = 2, irrespective of God, with mathematics being a distinct phenomena, then he is not the origin of all things. If something exists that precedes him and only within its confines can he operate, then is he really omnipotent? The response to this is usually a frustrating cop-out, such as God is mathematics and that sort of thing. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
I wrote here briefly, I've never understood deism, the belief in a God, which as I understand it is the belief in a God who has no further involvement beyond the initial act of creation and is effectively inert. An impartial, unaccountable God would be the same as having no God at all. I mean, I think of deism as the argument of God as an absentee father or a deadbeat dad. You know, he clears off after the initial act. Let's see. Yeah. Oh yeah, there is a little more I can share here. As I say, it might have overlaps with what I already wrote earlier, and in some ways be a little different or expand upon it. Yeah, this was getting back to my conception of a perfect world, or as perfect as I can imagine it anyway, which is leaps and bounds better than what we've got. In this world, there is more for us to see than can ever be seen, more for us to do than could ever be done, and more for us to know than can ever be known. We spend the vast majority of our lives doing menial tasks, chores that we would never perform by choice, even if we had an eternity of time to spend. For that is what we truly yearn for, an eternity to spend in the world of our heart's desire. A single human lifetime is but a drop in the vast cosmic ocean. We cannot feign ignorance of this, but still we blot it out from our minds. It seems regret at being merely human is a quintessentially paradoxical aspect of what it means to be human. We know that those qualities about ourselves that we hold so dear, our beauty, our genius, our knowledge and wisdom, will one day be lost to the churning entropy of the expanding void. We are a naked flame in the dark, so fragile and ephemeral. We yearn to be recognized by some outside force that shares our appreciation of life's wonders and our outrage at its horrors. We long to be acknowledged by some being or beings who would reciprocate our understanding of reality and give us the external validation we so desperately seek. We wish, above all else, for those aspects of ourselves we cherish so dearly to be preserved forever. Indeed, we can imagine such a world wherein those qualities exist in abundance to their maximum possible degree. What a joy it would be to dwell there for all time. I am steadfast in my belief that if there truly were a benevolent creator, then that is the only world he would have seen fit to create, as anything less would be a degradation. Let's see, what else have we here? There's one more I have. I have deduced that only complete nothingness could constitute absolute perfection. So therefore, an optimally calibrated world of my creation could only ever be 99.99% perfect, since anything existing at all would disrupt the static harmony of nothingness, if of course we assume that is what perfection is. I would therefore have to deduct 0.01% for this, even if everything else is perfect to an inconceivable degree. In any case, I have spent a considerable amount of my time imagining what that perfect world would be like. Obviously, it entails filtering out everything about life that I dislike while retaining and enhancing the aspects I do like. By far, the most difficult thing has been deciding where to impose limits on my own omnipotence. It would be a world in which one never has to undertake a task one finds displeasing. This raises the issue of having too much of a good thing, which is a bizarre phenomenon that occurs in our world. A world with zero suffering and maximum pleasure would be a perfect world, and the perfect world would never contain such a bizarre paradox. In our world, my world, the perfect world I describe, you could never have too much good thing. And oh no, wait, sorry, I've made a mistake there. I wasn't talking about my perfect world yet. I was talking about the world as it is. Sorry. In our world, meaning the world we immediately live in, you can have too much of a good thing, and sometimes we will, for reasons that are not entirely apparent, become jaded with endless pleasure. But here it is now. But in a perfect world, this jadedness would not occur, and so we would never become bored of endless positive experiences, let alone be concerned that existing for the sake of existing is circular. But there has to be some limit imposed on what you can and cannot do. For instance, you would not be able to change your sex, if you're a man or a woman, because that would then beg the question of who you really are. What is your true identity, that aspect of yourself that is fixed and immutable? One encounters this same dilemma in the concept of reincarnation. But would one need biological sex or any component of our earthbound identity in such an idyllic world? It's a good question. But obviously, there's going to be aspects of the world I come from that influence my imagining of a perfect world. So the perfect world is essentially, it might not necessarily be anything completely new. It's a refinement of what already is, a considerable refinement. I cannot imagine new colors, for instance. I am therefore, at least to some extent, bound by the laws that govern my immediate reality, and my imagination is constrained by the conceptual boundaries imposed on me by my evolutionary biology. I have said before that the problem for the individual and for humanity as a whole is that almost everything about the world and how it works is in conflict with our will. The few positive experiences that keep us from killing ourselves are, as we know only too well, mere byproducts. In a universe as macabre and merciless as this, it must surely be a miracle that they exist at all. While I do not believe a perfect world is possible, I clearly believe that it is conceivable, as I am able to at least partially describe it. This world would be one in which we exist to experience pleasure as an end in itself. It is a world that is conscious of human desires and reciprocates them in a simple and eternal tautology. We exist to experience pleasures, and pleasures exist aplenty for us to enjoy. While there are no states of deprivation per se, there are states of desire and anticipation, but these are always satisfied with the intensity we expect. So there's no disappointment. The world we happen to live in, though, is full of indignity, frustration, and the tedium of monotonous chores, which would seem intolerable if we weren't so accustomed to performing them. a good example of the unintentionality of pleasure in our world would be food. In the most privileged countries, food has long since ceased to be primarily a matter of securing our body's requisite nutrients. We eat for pleasure more than anything, hence why obesity, vitamin deficiency, and autoimmune disorders are such prevalent problems in industrialized nations. Clearly, it would be better for us if we could separate the basic utility of food from its hedonistic aspect. So we may enjoy the pleasure of food isolated from its fundamental value as a fuel source for our bodies. The reason so many unhealthy foods are irresistible to us is that they contain ingredients that were rare and conferred some benefit in our ancestral environment. But refined sugars and carbs are not products that our ancestors would have been accustomed to eating. Even naturally occurring foods like fruit now contain 5 times the amount of sugar they did a century ago. Much like cosmetics, these engineered foods are hyperstimuli for the primitive part of our brain, but our bodies are not equipped to handle them.
Okay. You said that, was there more, or are we?
Just one more. Yeah. In the ideal world, food would still exist, but it would materialize before us whenever we so desired, and its sole purpose would be to provide a pleasurable experience. The indignities of urination and defecation would not exist, as our bodies in this world, while appearing somewhat similar, would not function as crude organic machines as they do in our present reality. So much of our misery is exacerbated by the fact that we can very easily imagine a world infinitely better than the one in which we are doomed to remain. And I have a passage here which I've actually taken and put into the antinatalism essay, but this is where it was originally from. This bit here where I then continue on to say, we can see it in our mind's eye, but we can never get there, and it torments us to the end of our days. I don't think the vast majority of antinatalists truly want nothingness. I think they want a perfect world, the one that we should have had and that I had tried here, at least to a very limited extent, to describe. But I think what I have described, you'd all agree, is much better than our day-to-day lives as they exist at now.
Yes, I would agree.
Yeah. That's pretty much all of it, I think.
Okay.
One or two I thought would be there and I haven't come across yet. Maybe I took them out and put them somewhere else. I don't know.
Okay, don't worry about that. That's fine. That was really excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. I wonder if have you ever had any debates with theists, like with, maybe with, I don't know, university-based intelligent theists?
No, I don't think so. I mean, over the years, I've contacted people at universities and such like, but it's usually to do with evolutionary biology and that sort of thing.
Right.
It's not been based on anything theological, not yet anyway. I mean, I have watched theological debates take place, and to be honest, I understand them, but the people who are doing them, I have to admit, they're much smarter than I am, or at least to the extent that they've accumulated a lot more knowledge than I have.
Yeah.
I still think the arguments I put forward are very strong. I mean, they're convincing enough to me anyway. But these other people go into such minute detail. They have intense knowledge of scripture, and I often don't bother to learn the intricacies of scripture because I've already decided that it's a load of nonsense for the reasons I've gone into here, So I don't need to examine all of the fine-grained stuff when the fundamental building blocks of the thing are built on shaky ground,
Thank you very much for that, and hopefully we'll speak soon. All right, take care. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.